Hey, this is Barry, and in this video I want to show you some cars and tell you some stories about cars from when I was younger. This is a 1977 Ford Mercury Cougar XR7. It had a rear differential gear ratio of 2.50, and it had a Ford C4 3-speed automatic, and it had the V8 400. Which was the largest optional engine for that year, make, and model car. And the story on this car is that back around 1994, here in Shreveport, Louisiana, my father bought this car from the original owner, who was a realtor who lived down the street from us. I don't recall how much he paid for it, but it had less than 100,000 miles on it, and it was in really good condition at that time. I remember one time I drove that car to Longview, Texas and back down the freeway, and it was quite enjoyable. She was really smooth and comfortable to drive. It had plenty enough power even though it only had a 2-barrel carburetor, and the steering seemed quite responsive for such a large car. I think that car weighed about 4,000 pounds. It was certainly set up to be a freeway cruiser. I think it had a pretty large gas tank. I think it took around $20 or $40 or something like that to fill it up. That's been a while ago, but I know one thing. Most of my life up until around 2001, in most cases you could usually equate a gallon of gas with $1. So it may have seemed high to fill that car up back then, but not by today's gas prices. Later in the video, I'll come back to this car and show you more of the interesting options that this car came with. And this is another 1977 Mercury Cougar XR7 that my father purchased from a used car lot about 1981. This car was like new still, and I still can remember the little car lot sticker on the back trunk lid. The name of the lot was Kenny's Auto Sales. And this car also had a rear differential gear ratio of 2.50 and the Ford C4 3-speed automatic transmission. But it had a different engine. It had the Ford 351 Windsor, which came standard on this year make and model car. This car also had the 2-barrel carburetor, and as far as I know, the only 4-barrel carburetor versions of this engine were the first year this engine came out in 1969. The 1969 Cougars had the 4-barrel version of this 351 Windsor, and also some of the 69 Mustangs would have had this 4-barrel version of this engine as well. Don't quote me on that. That's just something I read in a book one time, but it seems like to me they could have made good use of the 4-barrel version of this engine in 1970 and potentially 71 as well, before in the early 70s when the manufacturers had to choke the horsepower down on these engines because of smog standards that were introduced in the early 70s, and the manufacturers would have had to have put on these smog components which had the effect of choking down the horsepower on these engines. At that time, that was the largest small block Ford V8 they made, and it had several things that made it different than the 302 small block V8. Was the 351 Windsor had a longer stroke. It also had a wider intake manifold. So, if you were around back in 1977 and you wanted a Mercury Cougar XR7 hardtop coupe, it would have cost you $5,274. And they produced 124,799 of those that year, according to the book I have. And in time, my sister drove this car for a while, and then eventually I got this car. And I have to say right here that this red 77 Cougar and this yellow one were both completely factory stock. They weren't super high horsepower cars. I guess they were kind of like a big 4,000-pound sports car in a way. But this yellow Cougar with the 351 Windsor, they had that set up in a way that gave the kind of accelerator response that is very memorable. I remember you'd be taking off the line. When your foot touched the accelerator pedal, the front end of this car would instantly jump about an inch in the air and you were gone. I don't know what it was. Somehow they had it set up where it was, I don't know how to describe it actually. It wasn't a super high horsepower engine, but it was just an impressive memory I have of how that car felt when it took off. I'm sure there's some cars today with a lot of horsepower, but for what it was very impressive. I think that engine stock was like 150 horsepower, I think, according to the book. It wasn't much, but I still miss being able to drive that car now. It was fun to drive, actually. But like I said, these cars were set up as freeway cruisers. And you know, of course, the 250 rear end, that's a low RPM for your engine at a high speed. You know, I once had a 69 Camaro with a 411 rear end. You know, it was quick off the line, but you didn't want to drive it on a road trip because that engine would be wound up, burn a lot of gas. I guess with today's modern transmissions, you don't have that problem anymore with 5 and 10 speed automatics. But one time I was driving this car, well, I have to admit, several times. I couldn't help myself. I was young. The car felt good. I would have it out, just kind of see what it had. And this car only had an 85 mile per hour speedometer. Yeah, the national speed limit was 55. You remember the song, I Can't Drive 55? Well, we had to drive 55 everywhere. So I got this car up to where the speedometer needle was slightly more than straight down, you know, closer to the zero. I would equate that to about 100 miles per hour. You wouldn't believe, but this accelerator was only down maybe 1/3 of the way. And this car, it felt like you weren't really going that fast. And it felt like it had so much more. I think this car should have had at least 150 mile per hour speedometer on it. That was a joke. 85 miles per hour, that was very inadequate for this car. But it felt good at high speed. It was just smooth, like a big heavy bullet. When my father and I would reminisce about these two Cougars, we always thought that the yellow Cougar with the smaller V8 was much more responsive than the red Cougar with the larger 400 engine. Was it the engine was heavier, or it was detuned, or had more smog stuff on it? It just wasn't quite as jumpy and light as that yellow car, and that's the only difference. One had the smaller V8, and one had a larger V8. Yeah, we agree that that yellow Cougar was much more fun to drive. One time I was doing some work under the dash of this car, and I came across an old registration, and it was registered to some business. And years later, I happened to be at a business that carried the same products, and there was a lady in there that owned the place, a local business lady, and I mentioned that to her, and I mentioned the name of the business. Of course, she had changed the business name because it had been so many years. And I told her about the car and how I found that registration, and her eyes lit up. And I believe she said, "That's my baby." She loved that car and regretted getting rid of it years earlier. But she also really loved the way that car drove. That's just another little interesting part of the story with this car. And at this point in the video, I would like to share some car stories from when I was growing up. A lot of my family lived around Toledo Bend Lake in Sabine Parish, Louisiana. In Louisiana, we do things a little differently. We have parishes instead of counties. And I once had a cousin by marriage who owned a 1974 Ford Grand Torino, the exact same color as the one you see here. We were always going fishing, The boat you see here is the actual boat we used to fish in. I think I got that boat about 1980, bought it out of somebody's backyard. And when we weren't fishing, we were hunting. Sometimes we would go hunting first thing in the morning, fish in the middle of the day, hunt in the afternoon, and then go fishing that night. They don't call Louisiana the sportsman's paradise for nothing. Although I haven't hunted or fished in over 30 years now. And we were always running the roads. There were a lot of dirt roads around there back then. And when we weren't hunting or fishing, we were working on old cars, finding old cars to get running. And I had an old boat trailer that we bolted a piece of plywood onto. We would sometimes find jobs hauling stuff away for people on that little boat trailer that we would pull with that Torino. And we would haul hickory firewood down to the local gas station, which also had a small barbecue restaurant. We would sell them this hickory firewood, and that's how we got our gas money. That's how we got our money for shotgun shells to go squirrel hunting and all that. And this Torino, I believe it had the rear differential gear ratio, I think, was 3.08 or 3.14, something like that. And it had the old Ford FMX 3-speed automatic that was a little heavier duty than the C4. But this car had the 351 Windsor. And I kind of liked the 351 Windsor. This car was just a big old four-door family car. Nothing special. And this is a photo my father had taken back in the 1970s. He was up on the fire tower that once stood on the top of Merritt Mountain. There was also a riverboat on top of that mountain that was a chapel. I remember my grandmother took me up there for church service at night one time. She had a 1972 Chevrolet, kind of like this one. And I have some distant relatives buried on that mountain. I saw the gravestones one time when I went squirrel hunting up there. But this view you see here is the Louisiana side of the Toledo Bend Lake. And the bridge you see is called the Pendleton Bridge. That was Highway 6. And the other side there was Texas. We often called that the 3-mile bridge, because it was a 3-mile long straight stretch where you could open up your car. And my cousin, he had a problem with a need for speed. He loved driving fast. He was always just seeing what he could get the car to do. And just about every time we went somewhere in that car, he would get it up to triple digits. And this car had a 120 mile per hour speedometer. Back then down there, it wasn't like there were a whole lot of police around. This was about 40 miles from the nearest town. And one day we were going across the 3-mile bridge, and he really put his foot into it. I think that was about the fastest he ever drove with me in the car. And he got the speedometer needle beyond straight down. And later on we talked about it, and we figured he had to be doing at least 140 miles per hour that day. But as time went on, he moved to South Texas for a job, and I moved to Northwest Louisiana for a job, and I hadn't spoken to him for about 10 years, and out of the blue one day, I have another cousin call me, and she told me that he had died in a car wreck in South Texas. That's been a long time ago, but I think she said that it was a single car accident and there were 2 people with him in the car, and they said it was his fault. He died in the car and they had to cut his body out of the car. He didn't have the Torino at this time, it was some other car, I forget what the car was. That's quite a thing when somebody that you spent a lot of time hunting and fishing with and working on cars, about the same age, dies like that. It's I don't know what to say, except I hope he's somewhere in a better place. Perhaps some place where they have factory fresh classic cars, any year, make, and model you would like to enjoy. But anyway, back to this red 77 Mercury Cougar. This car came with the sporty factory aluminum wheels, and I believe there was one of the original center caps laying back in the trunk of the car somewhere, and the center of the center caps had a red background with a chrome cat symbol in the middle. As far as I know, this is the most feature-rich 1977 Mercury Cougar XR7 that I've ever seen. It had pretty much every optional feature you could have imagined. It had the largest optional V8. It even had the flashy red paint. And as you see here, it had all the typical, the AC, power steering, power brakes. This car even had cruise control. The cruise control was optional. Most of these didn't have cruise control. But this 400, I suppose that it could have really been woken up with perhaps a set of 351 Cleveland 4-barrel heads, a better camshaft, some headers, a high-performance 4-barrel intake manifold, and a 4-barrel carburetor. This could have been a beast of a giant performance car. This car came with a deluxe dome light, power windows, power bucket seats, and the bucket seats were kind of uncommon because a lot of these cars came with a split back bench seat. As you can see, these seats were in really good condition. And this car had the center console with a floor shifter. A lot of these cars came with a steering column shifter. There's the foot actuated headlight dimmer switch in the floor. And this is the control to adjust your passenger side mirror. It came with a AM/FM 8-track stereo. I believe this car may have come with a tilt steering wheel. Also, this car came with a complete gauge instrument panel. It even had a tachometer. And most of these cars did not come with a tachometer. Also, most of these cars did not come with a full gauge package. The Yellow Cougar didn't come with a trip meter like this one has. And the Yellow Cougar did not come with a tachometer or full gauge package as this one did. And as you can see here, this car has never turned 100,000 miles. I'm pretty certain of that because my father bought it from the original owner and he didn't drive it that much. So eventually my cars and car projects got to be too much for the neighbors. So we moved south of town to the country, where I soon became overwhelmed with too many projects. And between those and keeping my newspaper route delivery cars running, I began to have to prioritize certain project cars and put others off for a later date. And the red 1977 Cougar, which there were quite a few around back in those days, developed a transmission front seal leak, so it was to be fixed at a later date. But with everything else going on, that didn't happen. And the Yellow Cougar had a tree fall on it, and its engine gave new life to an old truck project. So as life went on, I met a girl and got married and moved about 30 minutes away from there, though my parents were still living there at the time. Eventually, they also moved, and we kind of just stored our stuff there. And when you keep your cars at a location you're not living at, eventually people find a way in and either steal or vandalize your property. And what happened to the red 1977 Cougar was a couple of hoodlums vandalized it, broke every bit of glass and anything they could on it. Among others, my father had a really nice diesel 4-wheel drive pickup truck with only 76,000 miles on it. They stole it and hauled it across the scales at a local scrap metal place. Those were painful lessons to have to learn the hard way. But if you ever come across a well-preserved 1977 Cougar, it's worth saving. If I could only go back in time, this one would have been the one to save. And, oh yeah, watch out for those padded vinyl tops. Most all of them came with one. And if you're a car person, you already know those things are good for starting rust. Unless the car's been living in a garage for most of its life. So, hopefully you were entertained or can learn from my life lessons. Thank you for watching.